done away with all the snazzy intros and stuff now. I like to just get on with it and have a chat. So, right, that's us broadcasting. This is a outside looking in podcast. We're going to talk about sort of just drugs, drug culture, the laws, etc. in the UK. First of all, I'll do a little like sort of round robin so that I introduce you to each other and anybody that's watching, and explain how we've sort of met each other previously and why I thought it would be a good idea to ask the three of you to come back on. I'm aware if you're watching at home, just pay attention to what we're saying rather than the quality of the visuals, because I seem to be having some gremlins all the time and there's little lags and stuff like that. But again, you know, it's a podcast. It's what we're talking about. That's the most important thing. So I'm going to start with you, Mike. We did a podcast together. I'd not long been doing these, and I said to a friend of mine that I would like to do a podcast regarding the war on drugs. And it was actually a challenge to my friend who was wanting to get involved sort of behind the scenes. And I went all, you know, diva and said, get me Mike Barton. And then he got me Mike Barton. The next day I was on the phone to you. And the reason I wanted you is because, like we said on that previous podcast, I'd seen you on Question Time where you did your sort of speech, if you want to call it that, but it was where you was basically saying that we need to have a grown-up conversation regarding drugs in the UK. And I need to make it clear that, you know, this isn't a pro-drugs sort of podcast or anything, and that you certainly aren't, you know, of the mindset legalize everything. It was just you explaining sort of how county lines works, why they've gone down the route, why sort of criminals have gone down the route of using children, you know, the stuff that you'd seen. And yeah, that, you know, you said that there was a Darwinian spiral of violence, and that we need, the thing that you said right at the end is that we need to have a grown-up conversation about drugs in this country. So that's why I've asked for you to return. Also, at the end of our last podcast, which would be one of the first things that we talk about off camera, we were talking about Parliament and things like that, and the fact that the elites use drugs as well, but they seem to be left untouched. We'll get on to that. Thank you for coming on. Over to Rich. Rich, I've asked you to come on because, again, we've done a podcast, but you're the opposite side of the spectrum. I'd seen you on a couple of things, and then because you're an ex-squaddy and I was at the time serving, we had a bit of banter, and then I asked if you would come and talk to me, and you did. And your story is that you were a soldier that left, that perhaps didn't transition properly, sort of fell into a bit of the drug scene, and then it started, which is interesting, it's what we're getting to as well. You started just sort of doing ecstasy pills in nightclubs and being the guy that sorted it out for you and your friends, and it ended with you going on to become the Southwest's largest supplier of cocaine, getting busted with £3 million worth and getting a 15-year sentence. So I think it's interesting to have you on, and also what's interesting is that your dad was a police officer. You know what I mean? So you sort of, you know, all about that background, but you went down the route you went, and yeah, you're the opposite side of it in that you're the criminal. Not anymore. Obviously, you're reformed now, and you do a lot of work with veterans inside, and you've got your charity, and you've got your sort of program that you've put together. So it'd be interesting to get you on. Emily, you and I did a podcast regarding the trans issue, because you're part of the trans community. But during that podcast, it came about that you are also incredibly well educated, and you've got a PhD in pharmaceutical science, and you sort of can look at drugs, narcotics, substances, etc., from a scientific and medical point of view. So I was keen to get you on as sort of you're my Professor David Nutt. Yeah, and that's where we are. So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming on. And the reason why I wanted to do a follow-up, Mike, to the one that we did is because, like I said, at the end of ours, off camera, I'd sort of missed the chunk off. I was quite nervous, and I'd missed the chunk off where, you know, there's an argument that the war on drugs is a war on the poor. I don't want to get too deep into that, but what I do know is that a lot of people use drugs that don't seem to be affected about them. What we were talking about is the fact that Parliament, these politicians that come out and admit that they've done cocaine in university, they make a joke of it. Do you know what I mean? They make light of it, like it's just hijinks that they've done that. But actually, they should have a criminal charge that should have affected their employment prospects to the point that they shouldn't have even been able to become a politician. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. Both Rich and I made money out of crime. It's just my way of making money out of crime was legitimate. I was a cop, of course. I did ask for a grown-up debate when I was on Question Time. That must be a couple of years ago now.
Yeah.
It obviously fell on deaf ears, didn't it? Because I don't see any sign other than in places like this that we're having a grown-up debate about it. I mean, sadly, 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act is the framework by which the law is set in this country, and it hasn't changed much. They've tinkered a bit with whether cannabis is a Class C or a Class B drug, but mostly since 1971 we've had that act of Parliament, and it's not worked. In fact, it's got decidedly worse. As I said, when I joined the cops, Afghanistan was producing about 90 tons of opium, and now they're producing 9,900 tons, and we've got exactly the same number of cops, and we've got exactly the same number of amount of legislation. So I think it is incumbent on people in power, and certainly in Parliament, to actually ask the question: is it working what we're currently doing? And in my experience, 40 years at the front end of law enforcement, I don't think it is working. And also, I've never taken any illegal drugs. I might have had a pint of beer before I was 18, but I've never taken any. So I'm at a disadvantage in terms of what it feels like, what it does to you. All I know is that I can see what it has done to people who I've worked with, and what it's done to their families. And you've just made the point, Ricky, quite rightly, that some people in power make a confession that they took some drugs and somehow it's a natural part of growing up, which I don't agree with, because it certainly wasn't a natural part of my growing up. But also, they're quite happy, it would appear, for a lot of other people to have their lives blighted because they've got a criminal conviction. And certainly, if we want to be a first nation where we're an international trading nation, then it seems to me decidedly stupid to give a lot of young people convictions for drugs offences, because that automatically excludes them from travelling to a lot of countries to enhance our international trade. So I just find it all a little bit perplexing, really, Ricky, and I don't really have any answers. I'm just sat here scratching my head.
Yeah, totally. One of the questions that I was going to ask, and it was just a dead simple question, and it would be to you, Mike, because of the fact that you're from the law side of things, is why are drugs illegal? Like, what is the reason? Is it to protect the person using the drugs, or is it to protect society or the people around the person using the drugs?
I suppose it's a bit of both. It's very hard to get into the mind of the legislators for the Misuse of Drugs Act, for example, because I was still in short pants. But I suppose we could look. I always look at the example of alcohol in the United States in the 20s and 30s. And that was partly driven by wanting to protect society, wanting to protect people from alcohol and the dangers of alcohol, and driven very much by the abstinence community. Now, the same abstinence community were also making a push for heroin, opium and heroin to be made illegal. And what's not known is that they made a real push for a squeeze on the supply of heroin and opium and morphine during the First World War. And as a direct result of that, there wasn't enough morphine for pain relief for soldiers in the First World War. So now that doesn't strike me as being a health-related view, because there's absolutely no doubt that if you've got life-threatening injuries in the trenches in the First World War, then pain relief, I'm sure, was a necessary drug. So my sense from just that anecdote is that it's more of a seen as a moral thing rather than a health thing, because when alcohol was made illegal in the States, one of the arguments was they wanted to protect children and vulnerable people. But when alcohol was made illegal, alcohol became stronger, more dangerous, and was more accessible by children because there wasn't the state's licensing process that there had been heretofore. So, excuse me, I think that's the big problem that we've got with Class A drugs in the UK now, that the quality control, the distribution, who gets it, how much, how often, its availability is all driven by crime, by organised crime, not by the state. So if we want to make people safer, if we want to think about people's health, then we've got to accept that these products exist, and we should then try to think through a more sensible way of making sure that the vulnerable don't get it, and if they do get it, that it's not in a way that will make them very ill.
Yeah, that's Emily. You sent me some stuff earlier, and you were saying that actually a lot of the problems health-wise when it comes to drugs, a lot of the negative effects and the toxins, etc., are from what the drugs are actually cut with, not necessarily the drugs themselves. If you just bear with me, I'll go off camera while I'm replugging my laptop in. But yeah, Emily, if you don't mind coming on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you need to consider. Firstly, it's the dose maketh the toxin. And so if you've got impure drugs in their powdered form or liquid form, or however you're taking them, you don't know what actual dose you're getting. And there's a thing called the Therapeutic Index, which is the difference between the therapeutic dose and the lethal dose. And in something like heroin, which is an opiate, that therapeutic index is quite low. So the difference between the dose that's going to get you high and the dose that's going to kill you by putting you in respiratory arrest is quite small. Right. So the chances of you overdosing on either heroin, fentanyl, and oxycodone in the States is really high. There are other drugs that are available that are far less. They got much higher therapeutic index, something like ketamine or, things like even ecstasy has got a reasonably high therapeutic index. So there's that. There's the stuff that they cut it with. I've seen it cut with things like warfarin and, paracetamol, which you might be allergic to. So there's that. It's the way that you take the drug, so the route of administration. So if you take it orally, it's going to go through first phase metabolism in your liver, which is a detoxifying thing from when you've taken it through your gut. But if you're going to smoke it, it goes straight into your lungs, straight into your bloodstream, and straight up into your brain. So it's a lot easier to overdose if you do it through a crack pipe.
Right, Rich. Over to you, I suppose, because at one point was you cutting things? Or did you already get things cut? Did you care, morally, was you bothered? I have to put you on the spot and just ask, did you care what you was cutting things with?
Yeah, totally. So when I was involved in, let's exclude the ecstasy market, because we used to buy the pills in pill form, so we didn't really mess with them. We just hoped that they were going to be made by someone that have a degree of morality about them, and they were going to be okay to consume. And from my experience, I must have been involved in a distribution of hundreds of thousands of them, and there was never any negative feedback. We didn't lose anyone, which shows that the pills we had at the time in the 90s were coming through, and they were good. And people were quite aware of the implications of either dehydration, overhydration, and various things about not drinking too much alcohol, and to ensure they're eating the right amount of food if they could the next day, to make sure that their bodies were recovering. And from that experience, it was quite a happy time, if you like, because it was before the stress came in, getting involved in cocaine. And when cocaine was something which became the product that I began to work with, you don't know what you're getting, because if you're buying it something which is at a certain price, and Mike will probably verify this, that the lower the price, the more it's going to be cut if you're looking at volume. So let's say, for argument's sake, a kilo you buy for 20 grand, you know it's going to be cut with something, but you don't know what. You can get some indications through various tests, and you can, or we would wash a gram up and convert it into crack to get a purity. Wouldn't know what the impurities were. That's as far as it went. So when we were repressing it ourselves, we would buy it as a pure kilo, or as pure as we could. We test it. Yes, that's exactly. The last time I saw fresh air, it was in South America, and we would adulterate it. And then with that, we would look at what can we use. And this whole thing about people using rat poison or amphetamine, you wouldn't. Why would you want to kill your customers? That's really bad business. So we would look at something, right? What do people consume on a normal day-to-day business? So we're looking at things like creatine, which can be taken in certain dosages, people in the gym. Caffeine was one, although that caffeine is extremely strong. I've had drums of pure caffeine, and that seems to be more powerful than the cocaine itself in its pure form. It was unbelievable. And then there was things like benzocaine used in throat sprays and everything else. So they're all a white form of powder. And these mixed in the right sort of form, the right measurements, will produce another kilo of cocaine, cut down to whichever measurement. So morally, we're thinking, let's not cause anyone any damage. We are thinking about the financial reward, weighing up the risk to the reward of, right, okay, what's going to make money, what's going to make this a viable business idea, and keep everyone happy at the same time. And that was the route we took. And these were the three main products we would use. And if they weren't available, we didn't do it. We wouldn't find anything. But you could always go to Holland and Barrett and buy a tub of 500 grams of creatine, not strawberry flavor or chocolate flavor, because that just doesn't work. And just throw it in there, and off you go. But the problems with that weren't so much the drugs; it was the culture of the people around that. And it's such a ruthless industry. It takes a long time to get through this minefield of really vicious, horrible, greedy, narcissistic people, to find people that are business minded, and they've got the same kind of. I was a moral drug dealer. That whether there is such a thing.
Well, no, I know. I was gonna bring this in. I was gonna bring this up because obviously we got Mike here. But I know that you were sort of rare. I don't know if it is rare or whether it's once you get to the level that you was at, you were a non-violent cocaine dealer. Yeah. You said before that you just didn't get involved in the violence. Whereas I don't know if you've seen the clip on Question Time of Mike, and he is right, and it is sort of at that lower level that you're talking about there. But what Mike was saying is that they do a drug bust, and then what they've got is within hours they've got two violent gangs vying for the same spot, and the most violent one wins, and that progresses every time, and everybody gets more and more violent. And I remember from just, obviously I was the guy that would score drugs and just use them. Do you know what I mean? But I remember some of the people you have to deal with. You go in to buy things and you're worried that you're going to get robbed. Do you know what I mean? It's very aggressive. So I know that you weren't violent. Was that typical once you got to the level that you got to, or was there still real violence there?
No, the real violence is always going to be there in some format, whether you're receiving or dishing out. And I've never, hand on my heart, I've never had to get violent with anyone. I may have had to make a few phone calls to ensure someone pays their bills, but they never got violent because they didn't need to. Because I think the minute someone rings up and is quite demanding and they want the money is usually forthcoming very quickly. So violence is there, and I've been exposed to violence. I've been on the receiving end of it on one occasion, but I've never had to get involved in it myself. And the people that I've had working for me, very rarely, if ever, no one's ever been beaten up or hurt by a word I've said, and that is genuinely honest. Yes, people have to get aggressive over the phone sometimes, but the minute you start being violent, you've shown your full hand. You've shown them everything you've got, because after that, what's left after violence? It's unspeakable. And I wasn't prepared to go down that route. It's only money. I'm not willing to have life being lost, or me lose my life, or me go to prison and ironically leave my wife and kids behind through an act of violence which may not be necessary. So what I found is the violent industry is at a certain level, and it's up to a point. When you go beyond a certain point, it becomes less violent and more business-like, because only the businessman can actually surpass a certain level. Because after that, the gangsters are just creating headaches. That nobody wants to work with them because they're violent, they're aggressive, they're unpredictable, and they usually can be all borderline informants, because anyone is loud and aggressive and gets away with it so long is going to get caught, and they're going to have a choice to either go to prison and lose everything, or they do what they need to do to stay out. So if you can push through that threshold, it becomes very business-like, a bit like layer cake, I guess. You go beyond the violent form and it becomes like a business, and that's where I got to. It just means the stakes are much higher and you've got less problems. But if things do go wrong, it goes really wrong, and the finances and the losses are much bigger. And that was the problem that I faced at that level. It wasn't so much the violence, it was the potential loss you could take if you do lose a run, or a guy's coming from someone and there's an arrest, or there's something goes wrong. You're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds rather than a couple of grand. And that's when, if you owe organized crime gangs a couple $100,000, if you don't have it, that's when the violence may be forthcoming. Yeah. So it does still exist, but it's very, very rarely used. They don't need to use it at that level.
Like I was saying at the beginning there, this isn't a even with my stance, where, you know, we'll get onto it, my attitude towards certain drugs, but are we agreed that, you know, there's some drugs that just shouldn't be legal? You know, my main ones would be heroin and crack. They're the two that, you know, I can't see any way that they can be decriminalized, controlled, anything like that. Do you know what I mean?
But heroin is legal, Ricky.
Yeah, sorry, I know you're going to go down about
heroin's legal if you're in palliative care, because it's out there. It's diamorphine. It was actually, when it was synthesized at the same time as aspirin, and the people who synthesized both drugs, they called it heroin because it made heroes out of people, and they had no difficulty taking heroin to test it on themselves, the people who devised it, but they were frightened to death of aspirin. They thought that was a really dangerous drug. So now, I'm not saying that anything should be decriminalized. I'm not saying that anything should be legalized. What I'm saying is it should be controlled in a different way. And at the moment, the control was just described by Rich there. So he was saying that, you know, they were trying to devise a way to cut the drug so that it was safe for people. But if the drugs were to be cut by a pharmaceutical company, then that's when you know what you're actually taking. Emily talked before about not knowing what a safe dose is. You know, at the moment, I've just been a bit under the weather, and I've been taking some cold and flu remedies, and there it is. It's all listed there, and you know whether or not you've got two products with paracetamol, and you shouldn't be taking them both at the same time. And we just don't have that at the moment with drugs that are freely available. That's why I want a grown-up debate, because you can't just go from where we are now to a new future, where drugs are legal or whatever it is, and freely available. We should have any grown-up debate.
You and I spoke on the podcast that we did. When you and I were speaking about drugs, I said to you that the law, the fact that things are illegal, never ever came into my mind when I was using drugs. It made no difference to my decisions whatsoever. Do you know what I mean? I would never think, I won't put that substance in my body because it's illegal, because I was always of the impression it's my body. You can't stop me doing something with my body. Do you know what I mean? I'm a bit of an extreme case. I've always had addiction problems right from the offset. Funnily enough, I was thinking about this. The two drugs that I've had issues with was the first things that I tried, which was solvents, right? And then later on in life, as you all probably are aware, I had a bit of a struggle with alcohol, and I now don't drink. They're two things that I could go and legally buy from a shop without any, no drama. I could just go and get those. So I'm always a bit confused as to why some stuff's. I know you. When I say the word legal, Mike, you've got your own sort of way of deciphering what's legal and what isn't. But you know what I mean. There's two things that I can just go and buy from the corner shop if I wanted to now, and they would get me, in a state of highness, or alcohol will get me drunk. But then if I go, buy cannabis, which I don't think is as bad as alcohol, I run the risk of being arrested. I'm about to go into work with some, I'm trying to, this is my next project. We're going to be working with some young offenders with this sports trader charity. And I find it really, it goes back to what you were saying there at the beginning, Mike, when you were saying that we punish these young people with charges for things that the politicians do. I find it really hard work to sort of fathom that I'm going to be working with young offenders trying to keep them out of trouble. But what might get them into trouble is if they get caught with a bit of weed, because I don't think that's them being a bad person. So where does the criminality side of it come into it? Do you know what I mean? Why are they being treated like criminals when I don't personally see they're not being a bad person by smoking a bit of weed?
I think when we're talking about young people, we have got to start talking about it in a different way than the legal and the criminal justice framework. Because as you've just said, Ricky, it made absolutely no difference to your mindset whether it was illegal or legal. You just wanted to experiment and see whether or not it took you out of yourself. So I think there is something about young people growing up and making sure that there's an honest debate with them, and that we make sure that children are protected, young people are protected. But I think information is the best way around that. There's absolutely no point in just saying you can't do this, because we all know that the teenage brain is an adventure-seeking brain. That's all part of growing up, about trying to experiment in the world around you. So as I say, I don't have any quick fixes, but I do think that honest conversations with young people and teenagers would be far more beneficial than simply wagging a finger and saying, just say no.
Yeah.
I think for me, when I was coming out of the forces, when I went and I was totally dead against drugs, I was totally anti-drugs because my dad was in the police force. He did time in the drug squad, the branch, and so on and so forth. And I huge respect for the police. Now, the sort of the criminal side of it, or the lawbreaker side of it, didn't even come into my mind, because when I was coming on leave in the last, say, year, everyone I knew was smoking pot. I mean, it seemed to be everyone was doing it, so it became normalized for me. And over in Germany, where I was living, they at this point, I think they decriminalized it, and this is in 93, 94. So even over there, I'm not saying it was like Holland or Amsterdam, but it was certainly becoming quite popular, if you like, with some of the squaddies sneaking out of the gate and buying pot. So it became this like an epidemic or something, which is being normalized. So when I finally got back and I came out of the forces, and everyone I knew was doing it, I thought, well, it must be okay then. It can't be that bad if these guys have got jobs, they're working, they're getting on with the day to day. So I started smoking cannabis, and I wasn't a heavy smoker. I just enjoyed the fact that it was something different that I couldn't have done in the forces. And it's, I guess, for transition sort of thing, coming out of the force, it kind of helped me to feel like I was part of something as well, same as taking ecstasy. And that was my reasoning for drugs, but it just became normalized for me. And to see everyone doing it, it was just like, well, how can it be that bad if everyone's taking it? I know it's wrong. I know it's illegal, but because of my life in the forces, the legality didn't come into it, because it's normal for me to carry a gun around Northern Ireland, which is a lot of the streets of the UK. It's normal for me to be, involved in, say, violence in the forces, and see the things that go on in barracks. If everyone knows what it's like in the barrack room, you just get used to seeing things which are probably highly illegal, would be arrested for in outside of that camp. And then it's a very difficult sort of perception you have of what's right from wrong. And that was my problem I had when I came out.
Yeah, you know, I'll tell you what it is. I'm talking about cannabis though, but I'll come to you, Emily, if that's all right, because actually, I think a friend of mine pointed this out. I think that there does seem to be this sort of idea that cannabis is okay, but actually, from when I first started smoking, like Mike was saying, I was a teenager when I first started smoking, and it was solids, and you might get a bit of what we called grass. Do you know what I mean? And we would all sit around and we would get stoned in tents and things like that. And it would take a couple of hours for us all to get baked. Do you know what I mean? Whereas, now that things, is it a case of cannabis has done the same as the other drugs? Because it's illegal, it's now skunk, and it's way, way stronger than when I was young. Do you know what I mean? And, are we being blasé about the actual medical problems that strong skunk can cause on young people?
I think with chronic use, there's a lot of problem with mental health issues being exacerbated quite significantly, particularly if you're schizophrenic or you're at risk of psychosis. So, people will have, end up getting sectioned because they've had a psychotic episode and started, being delusional, hallucinations, etc. But probably the biggest problem is actually driving on it, just as it is with alcohol. You think you're fine, you get behind the wheel and you take someone out. You didn't mean to do it, but you thought, oh, I'm fine. But yeah, it's that kind of death by misadventure that is the thing that's going to get you.
Yeah. What I did want to come to, sort of, we've already touched on it, is the whole, what you were saying, Mike, drugs, if drugs are illegal for morality, right? A couple of things happened that made me think. One involving Rich's name. So it was on a Facebook post that I did. It was actually talking about something completely different, but we all got into different conversations, and drugs came up, and there was a lieutenant commander from the Royal Navy on the thread. He was on my Facebook at the time. He isn't on my Facebook anymore, but he was on there, and I made a flippant remark saying, I'd done a podcast with Rich Jones, who was a big-time cocaine dealer before he got busted, etc. And I think the term I used is, I was like, he was really sound. And this lieutenant commander popped up and said, well, he can't have been really sound, because to be a drug dealer, he must be inherently evil. And then I sort of put it to him. I was saying, well, do you think people that own off licenses are morally corrupt as well? Do you know what I mean? Because they're selling. And he got really angry and was like, that's a totally different thing, which again, I would argue it isn't. But then a couple of things have happened recently. There was a healthcare assistant the other day. She had no previous convictions at all. She very stupidly decided to be a mule and take 19 wraps of cocaine into a music festival for £200 for somebody else. Like I said, she's never had a conviction at all. She got 3 years for her first offence, and the judge described her as inherently evil. And I don't see it. And I wanted to ask you, Mike, is that a view held by the courts? Is that a view held by the law? Do you just see people, not you personally, but on the law in general, does it just see people that sell drugs as evil people?
Well, individuals will have to answer for themselves, but I think evil is a really difficult word, and certainly I would keep that for the most evil acts, premeditated murder and some dreadful acts that we've seen in the last couple of years seem evil to me. But very few of the people I dealt with, I locked loads of people up, I locked hundreds of people up, and I rarely met people who were evil. I met people who were misguided, who made mistakes, who made wrong choices. But in my view, pretty much everybody, apart from a couple of people that I met professionally, were all capable of being rehabilitated and see the error of their ways. I mean, most of them were just sad that they've been caught, and it takes a little bit more time to work out, perhaps you shouldn't have been doing that. But somebody who is used to going into a music festival with some raps, I mean, if the judge feels based on what they've seen, but I would find that hard to believe. I just think that we need to understand a bit more. I'm not saying that we should allow people to just get away with stuff. I think we should be hard-nosed and good at investigating crime. But once you've investigated people and you've arrested them and you've found out who they are, then I think you should try to understand why they've done what they did, because you're going to have to try to stop them doing it in the future. And if all you do is wag your finger and try and send them to prison for longer and longer and longer, it doesn't work and it's more expensive.
Do you, Mike, get, as a copper, did you ever get really frustrated with, this is a bit of a different question, did you ever get really frustrated with sort of the difference in the disproportionate gulf between sentencing for drug offences and for some of the other acts that I would class as evil? Do you know what I mean? Would you ever look and think, you've got this the wrong way around? It's a case in point. Somebody that I worked with in the Navy has just literally, I think it was a day after this girl got 3 years. Obviously, it's a different judge, but this guy was done for 7 years. He'd been looking at child porn, really extreme stuff, and he didn't get a jail sentence. He got a suspended sentence because of his previous good character. And I look at that, and I know that you're a decent man. I know that you're a copper for the right reasons. Do you know what I mean? Does it frustrate you as much as it frustrates the general public when we see that and we start asking questions like, what is going on?
Right. Well, it's always, I'm just fiddling around because I'm having to plug my computer in. So just stand by there a moment.
No worries.
So you must never second guess, in my experience, you must never second guess what happens in a court, because the judge will be privy to social inquiry reports and all the case. And so I think it's that's why I've sort of a policy of not criticising what judges say and do, because they see it all. But and if there's somebody who's been looking at child porn, and it's a non and they haven't actually gone on to commit sexual offences against children, then I can see why a judge may not send somebody to prison. Because if we actually sent everybody to prison who looked at child pornography, then we'd have to build a damn sight more prisons than we currently have. I'm not condoning it. I'm simply saying that if we reach for the let's send them to prison as our response to things because we don't like what we see, then that would be jolly expensive. And the rest of continental Europe doesn't do that. They have a much more measured approach in that how they deal with things. We imprison people on an industrial scale. And generally, my argument about imprisoning people, certainly for less than 12 months, is it makes life worse. It makes people more likely to offend, which doesn't seem to me to be a sensible, civilized way. And it's very expensive of going about things. So now I've always been clear that if we've got violent offences, then, and the law's clear on this, if you've got violent offences, then you go to prison, and you go to prison for a long time. But don't be fooled into thinking that people have got light sentences at the moment. That's quite the opposite. So 10, 15 years ago, average life imprisonment meant about 11, 12, 13 years. Now it means 21, 22, 23 years. So on average, over the last 10 or 15 years, life sentences have pretty much doubled in terms of how long people spend in prison. Now, you wouldn't think that to read the press and
no, I was just about to say that.
But that's the case. So anybody who tells me that we need to lengthen prison sentences, and I certainly hear that a lot in the media at the moment, then they're lying to the public, implying that sentences have got shorter when they haven't. And I'm not entirely sure it's a sensible way of going about these things. I think we need to understand why people do things and then get inside their head to make sure that they don't do it again.
I think an interesting point. Sorry, Rick.
I was just about to say, Rich. Sorry, I was just about to say, could you just touch your microphone a second? Because there's a little bit of feedback. I think it's from. There you go. Sorted.
How are we going? Is that okay?
No, do it again. Do it again. Do it again.
Hello.
Fiddle that wire again.
Mute off. How's that?
There you go. Yeah, that's better.
All good.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, Mike. I think I agree with certain sentencing because the guidelines are laid out as such, aren't they? And you can't really compare someone involved in sex offences to someone involved in drugs. So they're two different scales, aren't they? So you're going to get someone involved in child pornography is going to get such. Somebody involved in drugs on a conspiracy is going to get potentially a lot more, depending on their category and their role. And I think sentencing lengths have increased, but people get probably slightly confused when we do. I mean, I know it's changed recently. You do half in, half unlicensed if it's a non-violent offence. For example, for me, it was a non-violent offence. So I got 15 years, 7.5 years in custody, 7.5 years out of custody on license, which I'm doing now. And that license is clearly hanging over you for all that time. And it just does keep you in check if you want to do the right thing. But if you're not, clearly they will bounce you back in. If you breach your conditions, you're back in. And people just presume that you're doing a shorter sentence because you're only doing that half of it. But a lot of people don't understand that license conditions are there for a reason, to protect the public, to consider the risks to anyone, to any known individuals, or the rest of the general public. And it's monitored quite well. My experience with probation is exceptional. They've been really supportive, really good. And I found the whole process quite cathartic, if you like. But other people have an absolute nightmare because they don't know how to behave. They're not ready to change yet. And as Mike said, you can't just throw them away and just hope they're going to get better. You need to offer them the tools to change. But a generic system won't work because there's too many complex cases going into prison, looking at their offending behavior. Why have they offended? Have they got trauma from from an early childhood age? Is there something which has led them down this dark path or down the rabbit hole? And they need a bit more attention. And like you say, to give someone a less than 12 months, the cost is ridiculous to the system. It's taken up space of prison, which people should be in there, and it should be in a community. And people are changed when they want to change. You have to offer them the tools, and a lot of prisons still can't do that. They're not facilitated to do that. The new ones are great, things like HMP Oakwood, Five Wells, Wrexham, for example. The three new big prisons built in the last 10 years or so are exceptional, and they offer you the tools to change your life, but you still got to be ready for that. And I'm back in.
Yeah.
Sorry,
carry on. I wanted to bring it back to the drug thing because you just said something there where you were talking about, some of these people have got a lot of complex issues. And my experience is that the people that end up with the addictions, the people that end up, the worst case scenarios, the people that you use as an advert to not do drugs have nearly always got some kind of horrible backstory. Do you know what I mean? Some kind of traumatic childhood. So it's almost like by criminalizing the fact that they've ended up a drug addict, you're punishing them again for what happened to them when they was younger. Emily, you're in the medical profession. Am I right in that assumption that most addicts? I can only go because of the fact that I'm in recovery and I mix with a lot of people in recovery. And when I was homeless, I was having a conversation with somebody today actually regarding a project that they're doing for young girls, domestic abuse, etc. When I was homeless, and all of the female drug addicts that I've met, and all of the female homeless people that were usually drug addicts as well, had all been sexually abused as children. All of them, especially the homeless. I've never met a single girl that was homeless, as in street dweller. I'm not talking sofa surfing. I'm talking has ended up homeless. I've never met a single girl that was homeless that hadn't been sexually assaulted growing up. So am I right in that? I'm not just making that up, am I?
No, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the top three drugs in terms of harm, so alcohol, heroin, crack cocaine.
Here we go. 2 seconds. There you go. There is.
Right. So if you look at those are all drugs that people take to lose connection with reality. They're not the sort of drugs that you take because you want to get, you want to dance and chew your face off and go, big box, little box, etc., and have a good time. Or, the rich people like Johnny Depp and Amber Heard snorting cocaine. They're drugs that people take to get away from the world. And they're trying to get away from the world for a reason. So, as you say, sexual abuse, stroke, rape, extreme poverty, homelessness, they all become addicted to these drugs, partially because with addiction, you get addicted to that feeling of, oh God, it feels better, and I think that's a lot of the problem. So the highest, it's ironic that the drugs that you take to make the world feel better for a little bit are the ones that are the most harmful.
Yeah. I've said this a couple of times. When you look at this list, this is a list of different drugs. This was done by Professor David Nutt. Emily, you sent me this earlier. I'd already sort of heard of him. If anybody's watching that doesn't know who Professor David Nutt is, he's a scientist. Again, he's never used drugs, but he is a scientist that works around drugs and the effects that they have. And I think, was he the drug czar when he put this together for the government? I think he was in that job for about 2 or 3 weeks, and he released this and came out and said, oh, by the way, alcohol's more harmful than ecstasy and cannabis. And he was sacked there and then on the spot. But when you look at that, I've said a couple of times now, and this isn't saying ban alcohol just because I don't drink, because I'm not going to pretend that I didn't love the boozy culture when I was, right in the mix of it. But if alcohol wasn't around and it got invented tomorrow, and you see what it does, there is no way that would be legalized. I mean, it's part of our culture, so I'm not saying make it illegal. It is,
yeah.
But I find it bizarre that drug, because it is a drug, that's the one that's legal, and the others are illegal because they're harmful. Do you know what I mean? That's where I'm with you, Mike. I'm a bit perplexed by it all sometimes. Sorry, Emily, go.
But think about it. It's like what you said earlier, from going from, soap back in the olden days where you used to giggle a bit and eat lots of pizza to the heavy skunk now, which is disgusting. Same things happen with alcohol. So you're not going to be an alcoholic on cider, more than likely. But plenty of middle-aged women are all addicted to bottles of wine. They'll drink bottles and bottles of wine in a day.
Yeah.
And then there's the high jumps as well. People can drink a bottle of vodka, and almost be functioning, but they're addicted, and it's going to ruin their lives. And in that graph that you showed, I don't know if you could pull it back up.
Yeah,
but there's the two colors. So there's the purple that's harm to others. So people around you, or crime, things like that, and harm to the user themselves. Now you can see that the harm to the user yourself with alcohol and heroin is a reasonable amount. It's not even half with alcohol, but it's the harm to others that is a major contributor to its level of harm.
What's meth? Is that crystal meth? Is it meth? How do you pronounce that?
Methamphetamine, yeah.
So that's crystal. Have we got a problem with that in this country, Mike? I've sort of moved away from.
Yeah, different areas have got different issues, but of course, methamphetamine was how the Second World War was fought. The Allies gave their soldiers in their iron rations amphetamine, and the Axis powers, Germany, gave their soldiers methamphetamine, and there's a theory that that's why they lost the war, because methamphetamine makes soldiers paranoid and extremely violent, and amphetamine doesn't do that. So anybody who thinks that methamphetamine is some sort of new invention by drug lords to earn a lot of money, it's been kicking about for decades, and has sometimes been illegal and sometimes not. And certainly when I was policing Durham, when we were in certain parts of the county, we had a problem with temazepam mixed with other drugs. and you went into another part of the county and nobody took temazepam. So drugs are a way of getting into a social milieu, as well as also potentially escaping the world that you're part of.
Yeah.
I think the crucial thing in all of this, and both Emily and Richard touched on it as well as you, is that when people are addicted, that's a medical issue. That's a psychological issue. It can never be fixed by the criminal justice system. If people have done bad things, then I think it's appropriate the criminal justice system deals with people. But to expect the criminal justice system to actually deal with addiction satisfactorily is living in cloud cuckoo land. It's a
I had that as a question, but I knew what the answer was anyway. It was, should addiction be treated as a crime or as a health issue? I get really frustrated with the fact that we still haven't gone down that route, and Portugal have pretty much shown the world, how they can do that. They treat addiction as a health problem, and addiction levels over there just fell so rapidly. Do you know what I mean? Through that attitude, as in, let's not criminalize people. Do you know more about that? I know bits and bobs about it, Mike, but I don't know if you've.
Yeah, well, what they did, and different countries and different jurisdictions have tried this. But what they do is they use the threat of a prosecution to encourage and induce people to actually face their drug taking problem. So what it does, it absolutely understands that the criminal justice system has a part to play in this, but more as a threat of the sword of Damocles rather than actually sending people to prison. And they also spent an awful lot of money in the health system to actually tackle this. So if you look at our current health system in this country, mental health has always been treated as a Cinderella. Well, I sometimes say it's worse than that. I think it's treated as a pariah. It just is not funded how it should be, and an awful lot of problems that addicts face is a component of their mental ill health. So I think we've got to really start taking seriously mental ill health, which is part of what Portugal did. So they didn't just siphon it off. They actually made sure they understood that it was an integrated system.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with the fact that people going into prison with addiction issues. Yes, if there's criminality involved, they need to be locked up for that offence. But some prisons are dedicating entire wings, drug rehabilitation units for people with addiction. 12-week programs are going in, and they're going through this program prior to release, and they're coming out onto the streets, and it's successful. That is potentially 60 or 70 bed spaces, if you like, at 35 to 40 grand per annum per person to treat them for addiction in a prison, when they could have done that in the community, which is, in my mind, is insane, because those prison beds could be used for people who are actually dangerous to the community. They are a problem. That's ones like me should be locked up for what we did, not the people with addiction. Granted, I didn't help that situation. I didn't help that demographic with what I was doing. And I saw the damage to what I was doing when I was in prison. The fact that all these people were just required to go onto these DRU units in order to get clean, to have a fighting chance.
How was that? How was that, Rich? How was that for you? Did that, because obviously we've spoke about this, and I was saying, was there an element once you got caught with your background, with your dad especially, because I know he's passed away now, but he was a copper.
No, he's still going. He's still going.
Sorry, I do apologise.
Yeah.
I do apologise.
No worries, mate.
But your dad was a copper. So you already felt the shame of the fact that you'd gone down the incorrect route for your father's morals. But then when you get to prison and you actually see addicts, do you know what I mean? And people that are suffering with, because it's funny, because cocaine, it's almost looked at as a separate drug from crack. But you can't have crack without cocaine. Do you know what I mean? So it's come from you. That crack has come from you selling cocaine. So did that sort of slam home that you're a terrible person?
It didn't at that stage. When I was inside, the problem I saw people with issues, people that were dysfunctional. They struggle with people skills. There's so many things that they didn't have or lacked in order to sort of have a basic grasp of how to survive, how to live, and how to engage with the community. And I saw that as a big problem. And a lot of that is associated to addiction, which is associated to potentially childhood trauma. The time that I actually was humbled by people with addiction was I was very privileged to be invited to a recovery conference, and I go every year. I haven't been the last 2 years because of COVID. I'm going again this year in Telford and Wrekin. Now, it's run by Telford and Wrekin Council and the Oaken Gates Theatre, and it's for people struggling with addiction. And I was very fortunate to go in there and tell my story about my journey through the army, involvement in drugs, and consequent sentence, and then trying to change anything in front of about 150 people suffering with addiction. And I was willing to stand there and be judged, and I was willing to accept anything. And do you know what it did? They actually clapped. I said, "Thank you for your honesty." And they're the most humble people I've ever met in my life, because they were the ones which could have fired a few fucks into me, and I would have happily accepted that because I would have deserved it. But they didn't. They told their stories about their strength, about what they've been through, about how they've recovered, and how they've managed to go from this literally a shaking mess. And we're seeing the image of them on these camps and the adventure programs, and they've changed their lives because they wanted to change themselves. So at that point, that's when I felt bad, because I saw the struggle they went through to get a degree of normality, and that's when I felt bad. That's why I go back every year and stand up and be counted, because I'm willing to meet new addicts to say, look, you can blame me as much. I know it's a two-way thing, but it's the chicken and the egg, isn't it? Sometimes you take away the addiction, you don't need the dealers. Take away the dealers, there's no addiction. It is a chicken and the egg.
Do you know what? It's weird with Coke. I was going to ask you about this, Emily. The UK is just awash with cocaine now. So in fact, I was going to ask all three of you separately. I'll start with you, Emma. So the UK is awash with cocaine now, to the point where it's like, it's a recreational drug. And when I was growing up, cocaine was like hard to get. Do you know what I mean? It was seen as, a hard drug. And now I go into places, normal pubs on a Friday night, and just it's everywhere. And I mean, when I say it's everywhere, it is just everywhere now. Are people sort of really underestimating just how much damage cocaine does to the human body and brain? Or is it a case of they've overestimated it for so long and it's not actually that bad? Are you there, Em? We can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I muted it. I was trying to be
bloody
well.
Bloody green jackets.
So there was if you drink alcohol at the same time as taking cocaine, there's a metabolite of the cocaine and its metabolite that's really toxic, and that increases your risk of instant death by cardiac arrest by about up to 25%.
Right.
So the main risk with cocaine is it's actually used, derivatives of it are used to treat arrhythmias in various heart conditions. But in and of itself, it can become what's called an arrhythmogenic. So it creates irregular heartbeats, and you can go into cardiac arrest and just drop down dead. That's how you usually die from cocaine. Or you can have a stroke. That's the other common one. But it's massively, massively increased if you drink it with alcohol.
Which if you know about the cocaine culture that's all of a sudden, awash in the UK, it's to do with alcohol. The two go hand in hand. Yeah.
And these people don't realize the risk.
No, people have a few pints and the next thing, shall we get a bag in? That's how it works. This was where I was going to come to Rich and Mike, because I've always been baffled as to how we suddenly went from cocaine being quite hard to get to cocaine just being everywhere. What happened? Do you know what I mean? Did something happen to get it from source to the UK quicker? How comes all of it? Or was it just a case of the market was there and then supply and demand? Do you know what I mean? Is it all Rich's fault? Do you know what I mean? Like where did that happen? Because it did just seem to happen over the space of probably about 5 or 6 years. It went from cocaine was not posh drug, but a drug that, the rich use, to all of a sudden, everybody down the local boozer's got it.
I think your person. Oh, sorry, Rich. I'll bow to your experience and then come in.
No, thank you, Mike. I think from if I go back historically from my journey, so roundabout, I got involved in cocaine about 2002, and I was in the circles where we knew where to get it from. Now things changed around about 2002 because the product benzocaine became readily available, or it was easier to access in the large drums. I won't go into the details of when and where, but we could access that a lot easier, along with caffeine and other things. Prior to that, was things like Novocaine, lidocaine, and other mixtures. Now, some of the guys using these products found that they were potentially volatile and seemed to have some kind of chemical reaction, and Emily might help on this, is the active with the cocaine, and it literally would melt and turn into like a gluey substance, which made it non-sellable. When benzocaine came on the scene and readily available caffeine, people were hitting it so hard, and there was a lot more to push out. So you seem to have two types of coke. You'd have your pub grub, which would be your 25 quid for a bag, and off you go. You probably got very little cocaine in it. You're probably sniffing more benz, creatine, and caffeine than cocaine. Then you've got your stuff which people which are really want to go, and they're spending £90, £100 for a gram of that. And that's your real stuff. And that's where I think Emily coming. That's where your problems are with the 90% pure stuff, because that's the strong stuff which people underestimate. And they're trying to sort of take a dose of that, thinking it's the weak stuff. They're used to sniffing the stuff which has been, you know, bashed to hell, if you like, which is maybe 10%. Then they suddenly jump onto something which is 90%, and they're trying to do the same amount. And that's where your problems come in.
And the other thing I think as well is when you've got sort of benzocaine, that is designed as a local anesthetic, a topical local anesthetic. So it goes up the nose, and you've got a numb face, a bit of a numb face. Cocaine, pure cocaine, doesn't do that as much. So if you're thinking, hang on, this is crap, so I'm going to do some more, and then all of a sudden your ticker falls over because you've taken a lethal dose.
There's no doubt that drugs deaths in the UK are phenomenally high compared to the rest of Europe. So something's going on, but tens of thousands of people aren't dying. So albeit it's dangerous because people don't know the strength or the provenance or what it's mixed with, more than the danger of the product itself, albeit it's dangerous. I accept that. But in answer to your question, when you said it's come about in the last 5 years, Ricky, that wasn't my experience, and that's exactly what Rich described, because Rich was describing 20 years ago when he actually was talking about benzo being bashed with the product. And that would be my experience. My experience is cocaine's always been out there, but it's the supply and the logistics of getting here that's been industrialized, because there's huge profits in it. Yeah. We've created narco states in Central and South America where the number of people being murdered on the streets in Mexico, for example, is utterly shameful. Police officers, mayors, just members of the public, and it's tens of thousands of people being murdered because we've created narco states. So because we've got this supply, we've got this demand, we've got these logistics and we've got this demand, we're actually destroying former legitimate countries. Now, I'm not saying that well, let's legitimize all this and then we can then it'll all be safe. We've sleepwalked into this problem because we've been fixated on the fact that the cops will fix this by locking people up and sending them to prison, and that'll solve it, when it's getting worse and worse every year. Yeah. And we've got to do something different. And certainly, you know, my heart goes out to I've just read a novel, American Dirt, which is all based on the way that drugs people migrate from Mexico because the drug lords have taken over the way they live, and it's heartbreaking. So I don't know what's happened, but I know it's not the last 5 years, and I do accept that in some communities, in some circles of friends, taking drugs is normalized, and we've got to do something about that. But that's all part of the grown-up debate.
Yeah,
I think. Sorry,
I'm gone.
I'm wondering if a lot of it's demand driven. So, if there's a demand, it doesn't matter how many people you lock away. The demand's there; they want it, and it was exactly why prohibition ended in the first place. They just couldn't police it. It was something that was really wanted. So, it's got to be part of the debate. It's like, well, where's this demand coming from? Part of it,
I don't understand, because I think we're at a stage now where I think the majority of the public would agree that the current way that we deal with drugs, the war on drugs that we were talking about before, I think the majority of the public would agree that it isn't working and that something else needs to be done. But there just seems to be nothing from the politicians other than we will be tough on drugs. Do you know what I mean? And I know they're doing it just to get votes, but I think to myself, I wonder if they'd get votes if they went the other way. Do you know what I mean? And they're just too scared to try it. It's really frustrating. Really, really frustrating.
Can I talk about that Emily said and Mike about the demand? When I was involved in it, we could never get enough of the pure cocaine to distribute. We would adulterate it, smash it for two reasons. One, so we could increase our profits, but that's so we could increase the amount. Now, if we would have had enough coming through to supply everyone with pure, then everyone knew where it was. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but the demand wise, we never could get enough, and we literally had to be rationed. So, well, how much is coming in? Well, I can give you half a kilo. I need 2. I need 1.5. It's not enough, and it was literally like that. So we would have to then adjust it to reach your customers, and they'd be willing to sort of adjust their payment or the amounts they're going to pay to receive that. So it purely is, there's a huge demand for it, and I wasn't, say, I was regional supply. I mean, I wasn't supplying the whole region. I was one of probably many regional suppliers at my level, but there was never enough to go round of the pure product. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's just a fact that if we had plenty of pure product coming in, we wouldn't have to bash it. We just up the price, make a profit that way, save a lot of effort of having to go through the process of having a factory to press it with, and all these ridiculous molds you got to make up, and buying tubs of Benticam, which are really difficult to have a clandestine meeting because they're not small containers, and it's like carrying a bloody great big drum from the back of a van. It's really dodgy. So it makes drug dealing really hard work. So if it could be easier having pure cocaine every time, that would actually make life so much easier for us, and it would in effect be regulated until such point as people at the lower end, which is where the problem is, people buying the half ounces, quarter ounces, they want a cheeky couple of bags themselves. Oh, what should I put in there? I stick a paracetamol in there, as Emily said. They didn't know who's got allergies against that. What other white powder have I got knocking around? Oh, that'll do. That'll go in there, because they're off their tits and they stick anything in there just to get a free bit of coke. Or they've got an addiction and they've been sniffing out of everyone's bag, and they're all short, so they put bits in every bag to make up the volume. And that's where the problems are. At the end of distribution, at the very end of that chain, you've got people who are suffering really badly with addiction, and they can't help but keep their fingers at the cookie jar, if you like, and they're then adding what they can back into it to make up the volume to hope they don't get in the shit with the person they owe the money to on the other end of the chain. So that's where I find the problems to be. And I never operated at that level. I just jumped in at a certain level. But that's where the issues are with the people selling the little bits, and they're just literally finding anything within the house which is white and can be converted into a powder to make up the volume. And that could be literally anything.
Bad.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time you've got, Ricky, but it was interesting when we set up a testing station in Durham city centre when I was still chief there. A bit like the testing centres that we've got at music festivals now. And we did it in the city centre.
That's my cousin that used to do that, David Caldecott.
And as a result of that testing station, we found that about half of the people who brought the drugs in didn't know what was in the drugs that they brought in. They'd been missold, or they'd been misrepresented, or they didn't know that there were other products in those drugs that they brought in. So it's a real feature and a real worry for me It goes back to Emily's first point, that the people who are taking illegal drugs, even though they think they know what they're taking and they're doing it in a safe way, don't know.
Well, that goes back to my sort of one of the first things that I was talking about on here, where, you know, why are drugs illegal? Is it to protect the drug user? Because if it's to protect the drug user, then actually by making them illegal, you're not protecting the drug user, because like what you just said, there's no regulation at all. If we was to get this graph up again, so I mean, what I noticed is that ecstasy was right low down there. And ecstasy is classed as a class A drug, and normal ecstasy doesn't appear to be that harmful. And when you go out and you take ecstasy at a rave and everything, there's never any trouble. Everybody has a good time. You wake up, you feel a bit ropey. It's the problems come with ecstasy when you're taking things that don't turn out to be ecstasy. Do you know what I mean? By and large, I would argue that taking ecstasy is far more safer than alcohol, both for the effects it has on your body and also socially. Do you know what I mean? I've never seen a group of people pilled up, you know, in a big fight because they're all getting leery. Do you know what I mean? It's the opposite. Everybody's fist bumping and hugging each other and listening to music. That's pretty much what happens with ecstasy. You know, you take it when you go out to a music sort of event and everybody gets on with each other. David Nutt, when he was doing this, I saw a podcast of his recently. He basically just said that he's of the mindset that the drugs that make people get along with each other and connect are the ones that they keep illegal, and it's the ones that cause problems that they make legal. So I don't. That's going a bit conspiracy theory. Do you know what I mean? But it pisses me off, if you like, the fact that because ecstasy is illegal, it becomes more dangerous than what it should be. And I'm not advocating ecstasy use. I'm just saying, out of everything that I've done, all of the drugs, the alcohol, I find it kind of hard to give you any real negatives about the times that I took ecstasy. Do you know what I mean? Except there was a few occasions where I took things that clearly weren't ecstasy. I can remember one occasion where we took something and it was nasty. You know, the effects it had on a group of us weren't nice at all, and that would have been avoided.
With ecstasy for me, and bear in mind, I started doing this in 95 when I came out of the forces, and I didn't realize this at the time. Clearly, if you've tried it, you know the effects. You know how you feel. You know how you become this sort of part of this group, if you like. You're all in this same emotionally, and it's this incredible sense of euphoria. Only recently did I actually realize that it was the only thing that I've ever noticed is it helped me to switch off from my hypervigilance. It's the only thing that did the job to allow me to forget about any threats which aren't there. Because you've been, I mean, Mike, in the police, you know what it's like. If you've been, I got close friends with police officers, and they know hypervigilance is an issue with, you can't help 5s and 9s all the time. And for me, look, in reflection, looking back at when I used to take ecstasy, I didn't care. I could switch it off. I could switch it back on again if I needed it, but I could actually forget about the risk or the issues, or I didn't look at the doors anymore. I didn't care if my back was to the wall. I could be in a crowd of people and I wouldn't care. And I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying for me, as someone that served and suffers with serious issues with hypervigilance, it allowed me to switch off for a few hours a night.
Well, 2 or 3 times. It's funny because at the beginning of this, Mike said that he's never used drugs, so he doesn't understand. So it is literally he doesn't understand what we're talking about. But actually, if we're being completely honest, when it comes to ecstasy, I know that most people that have taken ecstasy feel exactly the way that I just said, that it's not really, I can't really. So a sort of example is when I was in the forces, because a lot of the young lads joined straight from school, you know, they hadn't done drugs. They'd gone into the forces. That was the life that they wanted to go down. They would, you know, my stories would come up about my past, and, you know, I would tell them the sort of negative effects of, you know, the times that I was smoking heroin and things. And when ecstasy came up, I sort of would always struggle to give somebody, you know, the negative sort of side of it. Obviously, if you do anything too much, it's bad. If you drink too much water, it's bad for you. Do you know what I mean? So it's one of them drugs where I really do fail to see why there is such a stigma attached to it and why it's a class A. Do you know what I mean? Why, you know, Rich, we were talking about this before when you were selling pills. And I remember there was a stage where pills were as cheap as 50p, sometimes cheaper. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you were selling a class A drug in the numbers that would have got you a lot of time inside. You couldn't have been making much profit because they were just...
No, it's horrendous. When I first bought my first 4 or 5 pills in '95, like I said, doing a few friends a favor, I was the one that didn't give a fuck. I thought, well, I'll get them, not a problem. So, and we were paying £8 each, and that was '95. And then when I started progressing, and it wasn't the volume I was buying, it just suddenly happened in '97, '98. There were a few issues around ecstasy. There was a drought with MDMA. We're not sure why that was, but there was a drought, maybe somewhere that was originally manufactured, something that goes into it. Emily, you might be able to expand on that in a bit. But for some reason, there was no ecstasy. And then about '98, they came back, called Mitsubishi's, and it was rebranded as Mitsubishi's. And this is when it all took off. And then there was a price war, and then the prices dropped, so the quality dropped with that. So we went from paying, let's say I was buying 3,000 or 4,000 a week at around about £4 or £5 a pill. Suddenly I was paying £1 a pill. Then I was buying 10,000 for 40 pence a pill. And then it just got down to about 25, 30p. And I thought, what is going on here? And I thought, I can't sell them. So I'm selling bulk at 1,000 at a time for, 60. I'm making 20p a pill and thinking, I'm selling a class A drug and making a couple of £100 here. I'm going to go away for a long time. And I thought, this is just no longer a viable business option because I don't even know what I'm selling anymore. It's very, very weak strain. So yeah, that's what I stepped into the world of.
Emily, you're on mute again, Emily. What are the sort of dangers? Am I being blasé about ecstasy? Do you know what I mean? And
no, ecstasy is reasonably safe in and of itself as a drug. It was actually designed as an antidepressant, believe it or not, back in the 20s.
I can see why.
Yeah. The main thing that kills people is either their temperature goes too high, and again, it's often things that they cut with, or they get something called medullary washout. So if you remember, one of the things you had to do was make sure you drink a pint or so every hour or something like that,
Yeah.
So people would just drink and drink and drink, and if you do that, like you just said a couple of moments ago, water's toxic if you drink too much of it. And what it does is your kidneys have got a concentration gradient. That's how they do their filtration, and they reabsorb, salts and water, etc. So you do your water balancing in your blood. If you drink too much water, that just smashes that concentration gradient, and you can't concentrate your urine anymore. So your kidneys die basically.
Right.
It's called medullary washout.
How common is that?
Very rare.
Very rare.
Yeah, you're more likely to be.
It might be rare, but they're the cases that I dealt with, Emily, and
you're more likely
I also dealt with the cases where people thought they were taking one thing and took another, and they died, and dealt with a lot of cases where it's young people who are experimenting who die. So there's no doubt that the precariousness of the supply chain and the misidentification of drugs, as well as the occasional adverse effects that you've just been describing, all of that characterizes itself around very, very sad cases where people lose their lives, and then that's latched onto by the media as this is an evil drug and it's killing people on an industrial scale. So I just think the more we can discuss this openly so that people understand all these risks, the better.
I think as well, being in the police, you'd have seen. Have I gone quiet again? No,
we can hear you, Emily.
So as a police officer, you'd have seen what A&E is like on a Friday or Saturday night. You'd have seen what towns are like, Durham or Newcastle on a Friday, Saturday night. The carnage, and people are injured, they're bleeding, they've overdosed on alcohol. They need their stomachs pumped. They have accidents. I saw a guy get run over by a bus in Cardiff once, because he was drunk and fell under a bus, got squashed. So those levels of harm seem to be much more common, even though obviously alcohol is much more commonly drunk. But I think if you looked at the relative risk, I think the relative risk of alcohol, of dying or getting seriously injured, etc., would be much, much higher per dose, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
of course I agree with you. And alcohol, if there wasn't any alcohol misuse out there, you'd need police forces half their size.
Yeah, alcohol is a funny one, isn't it? Because it's like what I was saying, out of everything that I've taken, alcohol is the one that caused me the most problems. In recovery, especially, I don't go to so many at the moment. But when I was going to the meetings, I'll tell you now that I've spoke to a few people. And this goes back to what that lieutenant commander was saying when I asked him whether he thought that people that run off license were as inherently evil as what he thought Rich was for selling cocaine, because the misery that alcohol causes. And what I was going to say there is, in recovery, people that have got issues with drugs and alcohol, which they use that term, drugs and alcohol, people in recovery see alcohol as the same as every other drug. It's just a drug. Alcohol is just a drug to me. It's just a drug that you ingest by liquid form, and you ingest it over the night. Do you know what I mean? But it's a drug, and there seems to, I don't know why, but some people seem to separate it from the rest of the other drugs and see alcohol as okay and the other drugs as bad. And I think that needs to be talked about more, that people need to realize that alcohol is the same as the other drugs that we've talked about. It's just got a different name. It is a drug. Do you know what I mean? And it's a drug that's caused me all sorts of problems. It took me a long time to get to grips with it, and it's one that I never ever want to take again. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that's my views on alcohol.
I think Mike said another word which I picked up on it, and that's misuse. Is people understanding the difference between use, misuse, and abuse. There are 3 different levels when you're taking any substance or drug, and that is understanding what is the correct use for that thing, at what point am I misusing it, and when am I abusing it. And it's people defining that difference and understanding what rabbit hole they can go down if they start abusing certain drugs or alcohol, whichever one it is, and what is a safe. What's the safe zone of where they can use this product or this drug or this substance and stay safe? And then what point does it sort of step over the line into misuse? And at what point does it go into abuse? And that's what a lot of people don't understand, where that line is drawn. And for some people, it's different. Tolerance levels may make a difference, but it's a valid point that people need to see that anything can be misused and be problematic if misused.
Right, I just wanted to we won't go on for too long. We've covered a lot. I do want to ask this though: is the war on drugs a war on the poor? Do you know what I mean? Because who gets affected the most by the war on drugs? Because I'm a sort of social chameleon. There was a period of my life in my early 20s. I did some volunteering out in Africa, and I became friends with some very rich people. And for a while, I was moving in the circles of rich people, and they'd done just as many drugs as the poor people that I'd done drugs with, but none of them ever got busted. Do you know what I mean?
The criminal justice system, as we've designed it, was designed by rich people to keep poor people from stealing their rabbit game and shiny stuff that they had that other people didn't have. Albeit, we've probably civilized it a bit over the last few decades, it's still principally that. It's the police are policing the dispossessed more than they are policing the people who live behind gates and gated communities and live privileged lives that are away from the public gaze. And so that the people that you tend to find in magistrates' courts in huge numbers are the people who are poor, who haven't got much. And we heard why a lot of people end up with criminal backgrounds, and that's because they've got ACEs, adverse child experiences, childhood trauma. You have 3 or 4 adverse child experiences before you're 10. You're sometimes 25 times more likely to go to prison than somebody who hasn't.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm that statistic. Do you know what I mean? That's something that I've learned over the last couple of years, just with some of the things that I've been studying. You know, I was in care. People that are in care are more likely to go to prison. I was then excluded from school. People that are, young men, especially young lads that are excluded from school by the age of 14, almost certain to end up in prison. I was then homeless. Do you know what I mean? People that are homeless are almost certain to end up addicted. People that are addicted are almost certain to have mental health issues. Do you know what I mean? And there was a point where by 16, with some of the charges that I had that weren't serious, but, you know, I had a couple of drugs charges on there, a couple of thefts on there, and that effectively wrote off any chance I have of had.
You're unusual, Ricky, because you got off that treadmill. People generally, once you get on this treadmill, it's jolly hard to get off.
No, I know, and I'm still friends with people. You know, I went round to a friend, and I called him a friend. He's somebody that I basically go and check up on because he never got off the treadmill, and his life isn't. He's happy, but well, I say he's happy, but I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing him because his life hasn't amounted to much, if I'm being, you know, really honest. But a lot of that's because of his past, and I'm aware that I am sort of different in that I did get off of that treadmill. I don't know why. I wrote an email yesterday and said that I just seemed to make a couple of good decisions amongst all of the bad ones that I made, and I got a bit lucky. Do you know what I mean? But I got off the treadmill eventually, but I still statistically done all the things that usually happen to kids that are in care. And on top of that, by the time I was 15, I had charges on my criminal record that then stopped me finding gainful employment. Do you know what I mean? Or, you know, people would judge me on that. There seems to have been a bit of a shift in the attitude. Like I said, with the stuff that we're planning on doing, working with ex-offenders, we've been talking to employers, etc., asking whether they would consider employing somebody who's got a criminal record. A lot of people these days seem to be willing to say if they've made a mistake, they've made a mistake, but they deserve a second chance. There was a while back there where that wasn't an option. Do you know what I mean? And I had to completely lie my way from, you know, washing dishes was all right. You could get that job with a criminal record. But from there, I wanted to sort of work my way up, and, you know, I had to lie. The way that I did it, if anybody's watching, they want a top tip. The way that I did it was I wanted to try and get into sort of the call center environment and the office environment. So I looked for call centers that had gone bust, and I put those down on my CV and said that that's where I'd been working. And, you know, there was no way of proving I wasn't there. And that's what got me through the door. But really, I shouldn't have had to lie because I was always clearly capable of going to work in that environment. Do you know what I mean? It's just because of my past, I had to do that top tip that I've just told people about. So there you go. That's how you get a job, people. Just lie.
Lie.
So with this war on the poor thing, I think you perceive it as that because of something called selection bias.
Right.
So the drugs that are highly addictive are the ones that we just talked about earlier, that are the ones that almost always used by the poor to get away from it.
Yeah.
And because they're addicted and they haven't got any money, they become criminals. They start, you know, turning to crime to fund their addiction. Then they come to the attention of the law. They end up in prison. They're released. It's particularly as Mike said, if they're only in for 12 months, they're basically going to the University of Criminality. So they're back on the street. You haven't fixed the underlying problem. So now they're back to addiction, back into the criminal system. And it's just a, you know, self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas something like cocaine or, you know, whatever it is rich people use, you know, MDMA, etc., those aren't drugs of addiction necessarily. Crack is, but coke is much less so. So, you know, we talked beforehand about how in Parliament, only one toilet in the entire Parliament didn't have cocaine residue on the cistern. You know, so obviously people in power can have access to decent cocaine, but they don't come to the attention of the law because they're not, you know, robbing people's houses or whatever, or stealing mobile phones. So they don't get arrested. They don't come to the attention of the law enforcement, and therefore it's not considered so much of an issue. So it's because it's selection bias, because poor people are the ones that likely to get caught for the crime that they're doing to fund their addiction. That's why you think it's a war on the poor.
Right. Got you. Right. Well, I think that we've had a good hour and 25 minutes conversation there. I think that it was the grown-up conversation that Mike said he'd like to have. I've enjoyed it. Just want to say thank you for coming on to everybody. I just say people watching at home, I'm supposed to do this all the way through, but I never do. If you like the content, please press subscribe, hit the notifications and stuff. I do a few of these about various subjects. I always forget to tell people to subscribe. Is there anything anybody would like to add before?
Yeah, well, I would like to say it clearly isn't a war on the poor, because Rich would see it as a war on the rich.
See it as a war on me. War on me. Yeah. It's definitely a war on me.
I was going to say, you know what it is? We didn't touch on this, even though we spoke about it. When me and Rich did the podcast the last time, I was still in the Royal Navy, so I had to be sort of really careful that I didn't get myself into trouble. And I was like, you know, you deserve to go to prison for 15 years. But actually, you got a really harsh sentence compared to, you know, what other people would get. So, you know, maybe there was a war on Rich.
Yeah, it was my first offence as well. I've only ever broke the law once. I just broke one law. It's just a really bad one for
Rich,
a long time.
Rich, you only ever got caught once. I'm pretty sure you've been breaking the law for a little while before that. So.
I've been breaking it I just didn't stop breaking the same one for a long time.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, I just wanted to say thank you for everybody for coming on. I've really enjoyed it. I've had a couple of mates messaging me while we've been doing it, just saying this is brilliant. I think that it's a really good mix of people that we've got: the user, the scientist, the copper, and the ex-dealer. So yeah, thank you very much. I will end the broadcast now. Let me just double check. Yep.